So it looks like former NBA legend Dominique Wilkins has some very disturbing comments towards former Clippers player JJ Riddick. And, you know, there's been words back and forth, or I'm not going to say back and forth, but there's been words said from Dominique Wilkins about JJ Riddick before. And this situation has stemmed from the past as well. So this situation here specifically is about Larry Bird. And I can remember JJ Riddick speaking on Larry Bird. I think he spoke on him on First Take at the time. He actually spoke on him a little bit on his podcast too, but he spoke on Larry Bird, saying in regards to the physicality of the game, you know, he questions the physicality of the game of Larry Bird and, you know, of the physicality of what he went through in regards to somebody like Stephen Curry, the physicality that he goes through, you know what I'm saying, in this era. And he was really, you know, just comparing the two, saying basically how each shooter, what advantages and what disadvantages they have in regards to physicality of the game itself and the physicality of, you know, their game individually, you know, of what they can endure. So in him saying that, I feel like I guess he offended Dominique Wilkins, because Dominique says that you got to look at the game itself, and the game itself was more physical back then in Larry Bird's time. So it was harder for Larry Bird to be as great as he was with more physicality, less fouls called, and, you know, you just had to really play hard and play through injuries and all the things that you don't have to do in today's game. And I think Dominique has a point, because the game back then was so much more physical. It was so much more different. They made a lot less money, but they also played through a lot more injuries too. So, I mean, when you think about that in its entirety, that says a lot in regards to what Dominique is talking about physicality. And it says a lot about what Larry Bird had to go through as a player, you know, just to get his shots off and just to score at a high clip the way he did and be the dominant player that he was in his time. And, you know, the crazy thing about it is, I feel like JJ Riddick is, you know, he made a good point about the physicality this era. I mean, whether the physicality back then or now, it's just as tough to go out there and put up 30 points. You know what I'm saying? Just as it was back then. Now, of course, you know, that's somewhat of JJ's argument. Now, he might have more added to that, and you can go and read a little bit depth and, you know, and further and check it out yourself. But more in depth, he adds more in depth to that. But from what I get out of it, that's what he's saying. And I could, you know, be interpreting that a little bit differently, but I've listened to that conversation that he had a couple of times, and that's the gist that I get out of it. And JJ, he has some points. I'm not saying he doesn't, but when we talk about physicality of either era, this, like I said, the older era definitely was more physical, but the game is definitely much faster now. So it has less physicality in the game than it did years ago. Granted that, but at the same time, the game is so much faster and it's so much more predicated on the 3-point shot that it gives Stephen Curry an advantage. So, I mean, in this situation here specifically, I can see why a lot of people might side with Dominique Wilkins, because it was tougher for Larry Bird to really get off all those points and score at a high clip and shoot all those threes and be dominant the way he was in a sport where it was all physicality. The refs swallowed their whistle. They never really blew it. And it seems like some of the highlights that I looked at back then, it looks like some of the referees and all those guys kind of like let the guys fight a little bit. They didn't really jump in too much. I mean, there was some fights that really broke out back in the 80s and 90s from the highlights and stuff and the clips and stuff that I've seen, you know, of the players back then. So it was a lot more rougher. You had to be a lot more stronger mentally, physically, you know, all the above. So I definitely understand where Dominique is coming from. And like I said, to me, when I look at this era, I will say it's still tough in this era, though. I understand Stephen Curry is a great shooter and the game is less physical and all those things, but don't get it twisted. I mean, this era is still tough. I mean, you still have to go out there and perform. You can't go out there and just get 30 points easily, because if that's the case, everybody in the world would make the NBA if you can go out there and just score 30 points easily. Stephen Curry makes it look easy because he's such a great shooter. And I'm not even the biggest Stephen Curry fan, but I do respect his game, and I do respect the fact that he is an elite player, and he is a transcendent player at that. And from what I saw or what I heard of, Larry Bird was the same. So, I mean, really, it really shouldn't be no beef between Dominique and JJ Riddick. I know Dominique says JJ Riddick is stupid for his analysis on the physicality of the game and how the physicality of the game, changed from how it gave one player more advantages than the other one. And I understand Dominique by saying that it's really stupid to look at it that way, because the only player that really went through a lot more stress in doing what he did and still dominate was Larry Bird. Because when you think of Stephen Curry, well, him having a splash brother like Klay Thompson definitely helps his cause, being him being the second greatest or third greatest shooter of all time, and some people think Klay Thompson is. It definitely makes Stephen Curry's life a lot easier. And I will say this in regards to Stephen Curry, I have seen Stephen Curry dominate so much with his jumper and play to the level that not many can. But I also will say this: in this era, I've seen Stephen Curry dominate, but I also seen him not dominate at times in big moments. I think that he went through several years or a couple years of those NBA finals. He didn't even win a finals MVP. One year, Andre Iguodala won the finals MVP, which was so unlikely, a dude off the bench. At least if you think finals MVP would be somebody more likely in the starting lineup. But even still, it got down to that because Stephen Curry's jumper at times is just not there in some big moments. And then on top of that, I've seen the Warriors lose games when the game was in his hands just because Klay Thompson wasn't around. So sometimes it kind of seems like because he's got the second or third best shooter or the best shooter of all time in Klay Thompson, which some people believe, arguably, I feel like that's more to Stephen Curry's advantage. And I feel like that's what really helps Stephen Curry be as great as he is. I'm not saying he wouldn't be a great shooter, but without Klay Thompson, you can make a case that his whole life and his whole NBA career would be a lot different without Klay Thompson. You see what I'm saying? But you can say the same for Larry Bird. But at the same time, people must believe that Larry Bird was just more dominant. I'm pretty sure Dominique Wilkins definitely believes that. And a lot of people back in his era and people in this era is probably riding with more of JJ Riddick. And see, that's my thing about it. That's what makes it even more biased. It just depends on what era you came from based upon the answer that you get in regards to the situation. But either way, physicality is still in the game. It's not as much or as predicated as much as it used to, but it's still in the game and it's still a part of the game. The game is just a lot faster now. So, your game, you can't be a one-dimensional player in this era, I think. I think you got to be more than one-dimensional. I think back then, as long as you had one dominant skill, you're fine. In this era, I feel like you got to have more than one skill, and unless you're so dominant at that skill that nobody else can touch you. And right now, honestly, I would say that Stephen Curry is really dominant at shooting because he's definitely the best shooter in the league. A lot of people say he's the best shooter of all time. So, he's so dominant in that era, it keeps him afloat and it keeps him at the top of the food chain. So, either way, how you look at it, both players are great or were great, is or were great. And either era, both players have dominated. But hey, that's my take on everything. Leave any comments and we'll talk about it.